In 1915, men were cutting peat for the winter in a boggy stretch of land in northern Denmark. Several feet down, they found something that wasn't #39T, peat. Human bones. Mixed with cattle bones, and nearby a ceramic vessel and a wooden club. They collected them, handed them to the local museum, and for nearly a century, almost no one paid much attention to them again. Just an informal name on an archive label, Vittrup man. A few years ago, a team of researchers finally decided to ask this man the questions no one had asked him in 100 years. Who was he? Where did he come from? How did he die? The answers, published in 2024, surprised even the scientists. The man from the bog wasn't #39T from there. He had been born hundreds of miles away, in a completely different culture. As an adult, he had made an extraordinary journey for his time, and at the end of that journey, someone beat him to death and threw him into the water. Act 1. What the peat cutters found, peat, in Denmark, has been an essential fuel for centuries. Generation after generation, entire families spent part of the year cutting blocks of this organic material, compressed for thousands of years inside bogs. It was exhausting work, and every so often it turned up surprises no one expected. In 1915, near the village of Vittrup, in the Thigh region of northern Denmark, a group of workers found human remains alongside cattle bones, a wooden club, and a ceramic vessel. They notified the local history museum, which carefully catalogued what could be recovered. But in 1915, there was no technique capable of answering the most interesting questions that find raised. Who was this man? When exactly did he die? Why was he there? Without those answers, Vittrup man became a footnote in Danish archaeology, catalogued, preserved, and basically forgotten for over a century. Meanwhile, just a few miles away, in the same bogs of Jutland, other similar finds, Tolland man, Graubaal man, became some of the most famous prehistoric bodies in the world, displayed in museums, photographed by National Geographic, studied again and again. Vittrup, by comparison, stayed in the shadows. Part of the reason was simple. Unlike Tolland or Graubaal, only the skeleton of Vittrup man survived. No skin, no hair, none of the spectacular soft tissue preservation that made other bog bodies famous. Just bones. And for a century, bones couldn't and #39 tell as much as they can tell today. Act 2, 100 years in a box, with no one asking that, began to change when a team of Danish researchers, with international collaborators, decided to apply to these forgotten bones the same techniques that had already revolutionized the study of Egyptian mummies, Viking skeletons, and the victims of Pompeii. They had three main tools. First, ancient DNA sequencing, capable of pulling genetic information even from heavily degraded bone. Second, isotopy analysis on teeth. When a tooth forms during childhood, it locks into its enamel a chemical record of the water and food that person consumed during those years. A record that doesn't #39T change afterward, even if the person later moves elsewhere. And third, analysis of fossilized dental plaque, which can preserve microscopic traces of food eaten during life, giving direct clues about a person #39's diet. Combined, these three techniques can reconstruct, in surprising detail, the biography of someone who in #39's been dead for thousands of years. When they applied these tools to Vittrup man, the first thing they did was date him precisely. He had died around 5,000 years ago, during the Neolithic, the period when agriculture was spreading across Europe, gradually replacing the older way of life built on hunting and gathering. In the Denmark of that era, farming communities already dominated the landscape. The problem was that Vittrup man's 39, Dina didn't 39, T match those farming communities at all. Act 3. What is tooth enamel remembered Vittrup man's 39's genetic profile didn't 39 resemble that of Denmark and 39's Neolithic farmers, who mostly descended from agricultural populations that had originally arrived from Anatolia in present-day Turkey thousands of years earlier. His DNA, instead, matched that of hunter-gatherers from northern Scandinavia, a genetically distinct population that had, for centuries, maintained a way of life completely different from the farmers to the south. And quote, Vittrup man was a genetic foreigner, clearly distinguished from the local farming population of Neolithic Denmark. In other words, this man, buried in a Danish bog, was not descended from Danes. His ancestors came from much further north. But the team needed to go beyond simple genetic ancestry. They wanted to know if he himself had been born in the north, or if he was simply descended from immigrants who in #39 de-arrived generations earlier. For that, they turned to the isotopes in his teeth. And here is the most fascinating finding of the entire study. The isotopes in the teeth that formed during his childhood showed a diet based mainly on marine foods, fish, possibly seals, a diet typical of coastal hunter-gatherer communities, consistent with the coast of Norway or Sweden. But the bones that renew during adulthood, and which therefore reflect the diet of his final years, showed something completely different. A land-based agricultural diet, built on crops and livestock, typical of Danish communities of the time. In other words, this man was born and spent his childhood in a fishing and hunting community in northern Scandinavia. And at some point in his adult life, he made a journey, whether by his own will as a trader or explorer, or perhaps by force, to the farming lands of Denmark, hundreds of miles away. There he adopted for years a diet completely different from the one of his childhood. For a person of the Neolithic, without efficient sailing ships or established trade routes like those that would exist centuries later, that journey was no simple errand. It was an odyssey. Act 4. The journey and the death, and then comes the darkest part of the story. Analysis of Vittrup man and #39, skull revealed at least 8 blunt force blows, inflicted with a heavy object. This wasn't an #39T an accident. It wasn't an #39T a fall. Someone struck him in the head, repeatedly with deliberate violence. And this is where archaeology adds crucial context. Across northern Europe from the Neolithic well into the Iron Age, archaeologists have documented a recurring pattern. Human bodies deliberately deposited in bogs, often alongside objects like vessels, tools, or weapons, and frequently showing signs of violent death. Researchers consistently interpret this pattern as evidence of ritual sacrifice, offerings to deities tied to fertility, water, or the turning of the seasons. Vittrup man, with his fractured skull, his club, his vessel, and his body deliberately placed in the water, fits that exact pattern with precision. The research team, with academic caution, suggests a hypothesis that this man, perhaps a flint trader or a traveller from distant lands, ended up becoming, whether because of his outsider status or precisely because of it, a sacrificial victim for a local community that wasn't an #39, his own. We can, an #39, know this with absolute certainty. Archaeology, even with DNA, can and #39, always reconstruct human motivations from 5,000 years ago. But what we do know with a degree of certainty that would have been unthinkable just a decade ago is the exact physical trajectory of his life, where he was born, what he ate as a child, where he travelled, what he ate as an adult, and how in the end his life came to a close. The stranger from the bog for more than 100 years, Vittrup man was little more than a note in a museum catalogue. A set of bones with no story, filed away beside a club and a vessel no one fully knew how to interpret. Today we know he was, probably, one of the most extraordinary travellers of his time, someone who crossed hundreds of miles from the cold coasts of northern Scandinavia to the farmlands of Neolithic Denmark, crossing not just geographic distance, but an entire cultural border, between a world of hunters and fishers and another of farmers. And we know how that journey ended, with at least 8 blows to the head and a body deposited, with clear intent, into the depths of a bog that would preserve it, in silence, for 5,000 years. Vittrup man left no will, no name, no written story of any kind. But his skeleton, read correctly, ended up telling a more detailed story than any inscription from that era ever could have. The story of a man who wasn't Hack 39, T from there. And who paid, perhaps, precisely because of it. Every bloodline tells the truth, even that of a stranger the bog kept hidden for 5,000 years.